More than 2,500 years ago, something extraordinary happened. In Greece, China, and India, civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers, human beings began asking the same profound questions at nearly the same moment in history. What is truth? What makes a good life? Why do humans suffer? And how should we live? This era, famously termed the Axial Age by philosopher Karl Jaspers, spanning from 800 to 200 BCE, represents a pivotal transformation in human consciousness. Before this time, humanity lived largely within the framework of local myths and ritualistic sacrifices to temperamental gods. But suddenly, across the Eurasian landmass, the Great Awakening began. This was a fundamental shift from the collective to the individual, from mythology to philosophy, and from tribal rituals to universal ethics. It was as if a cosmic clock had struck, and for the first time, the human mind began to look inward and upward with a new critical intensity. We moved from merely fearing the gods to questioning the very nature of existence itself. This is the story of how humanity truly woke up. In the sun-drenched agoras of ancient Greece, a monumental shift was occurring, a transition from mythos to logos. For centuries, the gods had explained the lightning and the tides, but now human reason began to take the throne. We begin with Socrates, the gadfly of Athens. He didn't walk the streets offering easy answers or dusty dogmas. Instead, he asked questions, sharp, relentless questions that peeled away the layers of human ignorance and pretension. His fundamental realization that the unexamined life is not worth living became the very bedrock of Western thought. Socrates shifted our gaze from the distant heavens down to the human heart and the ethics of the city-state. His greatest student, Plato, took this intellectual fire and sought something even more ambitious, eternal, unchanging truths in a world of constant flux. Through his famous allegory of the cave, Plato taught us that our physical reality is often just a flickering shadow of a higher, perfect realm of forms. By using logic and rational inquiry, the Greeks believed the human mind possessed a divine capacity, not just to observe, but to decode the underlying architecture of reality itself. Thousands of miles to the east, ancient China was descending into the brutal chaos of the Warring States period, a time of relentless warfare and political collapse. It was against this backdrop of blood and shifting borders that Confucius emerged. Unlike the Greeks who looked toward logic, or the Indians who looked inward, Confucius looked to the ancestors and the tangible structure of society. For him, the Great Awakening was a project of moral self-cultivation. He introduced Ren, the profound virtue of humaneness, and Li, the practice of ritual propriety. He argued that if every person, from the child to the emperor, fulfilled their specific duty within the family and the state, the world would naturally return to balance. But parallel to this social architecture stood the mysterious Laozi, the legendary founder of Taoism. Where Confucius sought order through rules, Laozi sought it through the Tao, the primordial way of nature. He taught Wu Wei, or effortless action, urging us to stop struggling against the natural flow of existence. He famously compared wisdom to water. It is soft and yields, yet it eventually wears down even the hardest stone. While the Greek thinkers peered outward at the cosmos and the Chinese sages looked toward the structure of society, a different revolution was unfolding in the river valleys of ancient India. Here, the focus turned inward, toward the very architecture of human consciousness. Siddhartha Gautama, whom we now know as the Buddha, abandoned his royal inheritance to confront a haunting, universal reality, dukkha, or suffering. He wasn't just interested in the why of existence, but in the how of our pain. The Buddha performed what we might call a psychological autopsy on the human condition. He identified the root cause as tanha, an insatiable craving and attachment to things that inevitably change. To solve this, he proposed the middle way, a path of moderation between indulgence and self-denial. Through the rigorous mental discipline of the Eightfold Path, he sought nirvana, not a physical place, but the total extinguishing of the fire of the ego. By realizing the transience of all things, he challenged the rigid Vedic rituals and caste systems of his time, offering a radical message that liberation isn't found in the heavens, but in the profound silence of one's own mind. Despite the vast geographic distances separating these ancient hubs of thought, the similarities between them are truly staggering. Each culture, using its own distinct vocabulary, arrived at the same groundbreaking conclusion that true wisdom begins with self-knowledge. In Athens, Socrates famously urged his followers to know thyself. Simultaneously, in the Ganges Plain, the Buddha was teaching the deep, internal gaze of mindfulness, while in China, the Confucian tradition emphasized the investigation of things through rigorous moral self-reflection. Notice the profound shift occurring here. The focus was no longer on external rituals or appeasing capricious gods, but on the internal state of the human being. There was a shared, radical emphasis on virtue over material wealth, a collective recognition that the good life is one lived in accordance with a higher, universal truth. Furthermore, each tradition taught a form of detachment from the ego. The Greeks sought the mastery of reason over passion. The Indians sought the cessation of desire, and the Chinese sought the alignment of the self with the Tao or the greater social good. They were all, essentially, trying to bridge the gap between our flawed human nature and an ideal state of existence. While the questions were universal, the methods used to answer them gave birth to the distinct flavors of human civilization. Think of ancient Greece. They looked outward, prioritizing the external and the objective. Through logic, the Socratic dialectic, and rigorous rational inquiry, they sought to categorize the physical world. This drive to understand the mechanics of nature and the logos of the universe eventually paved the way for the modern scientific method. Ancient China, however, stayed grounded in the practical and the relational. For thinkers like Confucius, the mystery wasn't hidden in the stars, but in the household and the state. They prioritized ethics, governance, and communal harmony, the Tao of human society, over abstract metaphysical secrets. Then there is ancient India. Here, the lens of inquiry turned most sharply inward. They developed incredibly sophisticated maps of human consciousness, exploring the nature of the self and focusing on spiritual liberation, or nirvana, to transcend the cycle of physical suffering. These three distinct emphases, logic in the West, social ethics in China, and the exploration of consciousness in India, became the foundational pillars upon which the world's most influential cultures were built. The legacy of the Axial Age isn't buried in ruins. It pulses through our modern world every single day. When we advocate for universal human rights or the inherent dignity of the individual, we are walking a path first cleared by the Greek Stoics. In our frantic, tech-driven era, when people practice mindfulness to combat the overwhelming noise of modern life, they are using psychological tools refined by the Buddha over 2 millennia ago. And when we emphasize the vital importance of family ties and social responsibility, we are echoing the timeless whispers of Confucius. These philosophies are far more than ancient relics. They are the fundamental operating systems of the modern mind. They provide the very vocabulary for our greatest moral debates and the frameworks for our most profound spiritual experiences. Despite all our technological progress, we find ourselves returning to these 2,500-year-old insights because they address the one thing that has remained constant, the mystery of the human condition. In a confusing world, these ancient voices remain our most reliable guides. Why did this awakening happen simultaneously across such different lands? It is one of history's most enduring mysteries. Some historians point to a material shift, the rise of iron tools. This technological leap increased agricultural surplus, fueling the birth of large cities and a new merchant class, people who finally had the leisure time to sit, observe, and think. Others suggest a darker catalyst, the sheer violence of expanding states. In an age of escalating warfare, thinkers were forced to find new ways of defining human value beyond mere survival. But there is also a more poetic possibility that the human spirit reached a collective maturity
at the same moment. Much like children growing into adolescence, civilizations across the globe simultaneously began to question their parents' myths and seek a personal truth. This great awakening reminds us that despite our differences, the human quest for meaning is universal. Whether in a Greek marketplace, a Chinese court, or an Indian forest, we were all asking the same questions. Today, we are still participants in that single epic conversation, one that began in the ancient twilight and continues with as much urgency as ever today.